We've covered how nature moves and how science reports on it. Now, let's talk about the phenomena themselves. These are the headline-grabbing nouns: drought, flood, hurricane. But I'm guessing that even here, we need the rigorous definitions that are used in formal scientific papers.
We must. We have to ensure we know the precise boundaries of each term. An informed communicator has to be able to distinguish between similar-looking events based on their mechanism, their location, or their severity.
Okay, where should we start?
Let's start with the dual extremes of water availability. A drought is defined as a long period of time during which there is an absolute lack or severe shortage of rain.
That emphasis on a long period and a severe shortage is so crucial. It's not just a dry week. It implies a sustained meteorological and hydrological failure.
And the collocations, the word pairings, reflect that gravity. We talk about severe droughts or regions being afflicted with severe drought.
The context is often about vulnerability, isn't it? For climate change, we look at how tropical forests are becoming more vulnerable to drought, which then leads to increased fire risk.
Exactly. When scientists measure drought severity, they use specific indicators, like the Palmer Drought Severity Index, to quantify just how far the actual moisture supply deviates from the norm over time. That's the rigor that's hiding behind the word.
Okay, so let's contrast that with a flood. A flood is fundamentally about overflow, a large amount of water covering an area which is usually dry. It often happens when a river flows over its banks or coastal defenses are breached.
And the impact narrative shifts dramatically. While a drought is about long-term ecological stress and absence, a flood is about immediate, quantifiable physical damage and displacement.
Right.
The key collocations involve measuring that impact. The cost of repairing properties damaged by the flood is often measured in billions.
So drought is long-term ecological stress. Flood is sudden hydrological overload and physical damage.
You've got it.
And we often hear about flash floods versus coastal floods. That differentiation must add another layer of necessary precision based on the mechanism of the overflow.
Exactly. A flash flood is rapid and localized,
Right.
often triggered by intense rainfall that just overwhelms the natural drainage. A coastal flood, on the other hand, is usually driven by a storm surge or high tides that are exacerbated by sea level rise. Using that modifier flash, coastal, riverine, demonstrates command over the specific hydrological mechanism at work.
Okay, what about ice and water masses?
Well, we covered the verb flow earlier, so let's nail down the noun forms, glacier and current.
Right. A glacier is an extremely large mass of ice which moves very slowly, often down a mountain valley, or as part of a continental ice sheet. The defining features are its immense continental scale and its sluggish, almost imperceptible movement.
And it's important to understand that scale. We differentiate between alpine or valley glaciers, which are constrained by the topography, and the massive continental ice sheets, like those covering Greenland.
So the key takeaway is that when you discuss a glacier, you are talking about a solid, slowly degrading ice mass with just massive inertia.
Precisely.
And the noun current, which we revisited, focuses on that steady flowing movement of air or water. We already established the Gulf Stream is a current of warm seawater.
But let's also discuss atmospheric currents, which are just as vital to the climate system. The jet stream is a perfect example, a fast-flowing, narrow, meandering current of air in the upper atmosphere.
Ah, right, and changes in the stability and the trajectory of that air current are what drive the extreme weather systems across North America and Europe.
Exactly. The precision matters because you are assessing fundamentally different phenomena. If you're analyzing a region, is the primary issue melt from a glacier, a slowly degrading solid? Or is it a shift in an ocean or atmospheric current, a massive continuous movement of fluid that regulates the entire regional temperature and weather?
In a formal assessment of climate dynamics, you just cannot confuse those physical characteristics.
You can't.
Okay, let's tackle my favorite point of confusion in global meteorological reporting: hurricanes and typhoons. We know they are both massive rotating storms. What is the fundamental distinction that's required for precise reporting?
It is purely and strictly geographical.
Really? That's it?
That's it. Both terms describe violent tropical cyclones that develop over warm ocean water, but the official nomenclature is determined entirely by where they originate.
So if the storm develops in the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, or the Northeast Pacific, it is formally designated a hurricane.
Correct. And if it develops in the Northwest Pacific Ocean, it is designated a typhoon. The exact same storm, if it were to cross the international date line, would literally change its official designation.
So a scientist reporting on a storm that hit the Philippines must use typhoon, while one reporting on Florida must use hurricane. This shows command not just of the general topic of severe weather, but of the global meteorological context.
And we can go even deeper for our high-level listener. This geographical distinction is also linked to intensity scales.
Oh, interesting.
While both types of storms are expected to be more severe as a consequence of global warming, the Atlantic uses the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. The Northwest Pacific region, however, often uses different wind speeds to define categories, or even different naming conventions altogether, depending on which specific meteorological center is issuing the forecast.
So knowing that local distinction signals true expertise in global climate reporting.
It absolutely does.
Okay, we have established accuracy and rigor. Now we get to move to what you called the final crucial step in communication mastery, connotation.
Yes. Connotation is the subtle emotional or attitudinal baggage that a word carries. Mastering this is what allows you to ensure your academic argument is not just factually correct, but persuasive, nuanced, and subtly controls the reader's perception.
This feels like the difference between writing something that's merely functional and writing something that subtly steers the reader toward your intended conclusion.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So let's look at how choosing between near synonyms can change the entire tone of a report. How do we apply this to describing human agency in policy debates?
Okay, great example. Imagine a climate leader who refuses to compromise on their deep-seated beliefs about environmental protection, even if it means political stagnation.
I can picture it.
If you choose to describe that leader as idealistic, you are granting them a positive or at least a sympathetic interpretation.
Right. Idealistic means they base their behavior on high ideals, even if it might be viewed as impractical or politically costly. You're suggesting they are admirable, principled, maybe a little bit naive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you want to critique their rigidity, what word would you use?
I would want something with a negative connotation, maybe something like the noun dogma.
Perfect. Dogma is a belief that people are expected to accept without questioning. By describing their stance as dogma, you immediately introduce a negative, rigid, and anti-intellectual connotation. You suggest they are clinging to an unquestionable belief.
This is so powerful. I could write, the administration's adherence to environmental dogma has blinded them to the necessary economic compromises needed for industrial transition. Versus, the administration, while perhaps idealistic in its goals, has struggled to translate those principles into politically feasible policy. The choice of one word dictates the thesis of the entire article.
And let's consider the contrast between the positive word tenacious, which means firm, persistent, admirable effort, and the negative word stubborn, unreasonably fixed in attitude. A strong team leader might be described as tenacious in pushing for policy changes, despite political headwinds. But a rigid politician might be called stubborn for refusing to acknowledge new scientific data.
Both mean they are fixed in their position, but the connotation determines if the reader views this trait as a strength or a fatal flaw.
Precisely.
Connotation must also be crucial when describing places and environments, especially when we're talking about development and land use. Writers must use subtle adjectives to signal their approval or disapproval of a given state.
Oh, all the time. Take the environmental contrast between bustling, crowded, and congested.
Okay.
If an article describes a city center as bustling, it means the area is full of people who are very busy or lively. That's a positive, energetic, vibrant image that you often see in pro-development journalism.
But if that exact same space is described as crowded, the connotation immediately leans negative. It implies discomfort, a lack of space, maybe poor planning. And if the surrounding roads are called congested, that is highly negative, signaling traffic difficulty and frustration.
And here's a fantastic contrast for environmental reporting. Sprawling versus extensive.
Sprawling. I already have a negative feeling about that word.
You should. A sprawling suburb or development is built over a large area in an untidy or uncontrolled way. The connotation is distinctly negative. It suggests uncontrolled growth, waste, poor planning. An environmental report would use sprawling to criticize habitat loss.
Whereas extensive is generally neutral or even positive. It suggests large coverage or depth like extensive research or extensive land ownership.
So an environmental activist would describe a new housing development as sprawling, while the developer's press release would describe it as extensive. The word choice instantly reveals the author's bias and their agenda.
That is crystal clear. Okay, let's bring connotation back to the verbs of change. These must apply to climate policy evolution or how a system responds.
Yes, finally, when you're analyzing a case study, your choice of verb has to reflect whether that change was good, bad, or merely procedural.
Okay, so give me a positive verb for change.
If you use the verb refine, the change is inherently positive. It means something is improved by having small, often precise changes made to it. Think of technology. Carbon sequestration techniques are constantly being refined. It suggests careful, ongoing progress and increasing quality.
And on the negative side of the spectrum, we have deteriorate.
Yes. If a global situation deteriorates, it becomes worse in some way. For example, the fear that coastal infrastructure might deteriorate faster than expected due to increased storm frequency. This verb signals a worsening condition, often with very serious implications.
And then there's a big one, transform. How does that fit in?
Transform carries a high impact, usually positive or neutral connotation. It means to change completely and suddenly so that the subject is much better or more attractive. We might say the adoption of electric vehicles has the power to transform urban air quality.
So it speaks to a foundational, positive, and abrupt change that shifts the entire paradigm. So when I'm concluding an essay on the success of international climate agreements, deciding whether the policy evolved, which is gradual and neutral, or transformed sudden, significant improvement, that choice instantly defines my entire thesis on the success or failure of global cooperation.
You've nailed it.
So we have completed our deep dive today, and we've moved far beyond simple definitions. We established the precision verbs of physical change, how massive ice sheets contract while oceans expand and the atmosphere condenses.
We mastered the language of scientific reporting, using state for authority, predict for modeling foresight, and estimate for necessary approximation. And we learned how critical the use of prefixes like over and under is for conveying immediate critique.
And most critically, we really understood how connotation choosing between idealistic versus dogma can turn a merely factual report into a powerful, persuasive argument that subtly guides your audience. The ultimate takeaway is that precision in language instantly upgrades your essay or your professional discussion.
It signals that you possess true command over the context, not just the facts. So as you move forward from this, I want you to focus on the level of certainty you're trying to convey. Are you citing a strong claim that's backed by rigorous research? That should be called conclusive evidence.
Okay.
Or are you presenting something speculative, something based on incomplete information? That should be precisely described as conjecture.
The ability to distinguish between those two contexts demonstrates true intellectual command.
It does.
We started by noting that climate scientists believe it is irresponsible to do nothing about global warming. So, take that principle of action and apply it to your own communication this week. Where are you currently accepting imprecise language in your life? What initial step can you take to refine your vocabulary and stop accepting the linguistic status quo?
I'd say start by just noticing. Notice where the media you consume uses these words. Did the reporter predict or estimate the hurricane's path? That single observation will start to train you to use these words with purpose.